Just a quick overview of our agenda. We're going to set the stage a little bit today, talking about our energy system, go over some of the key players, some of the connections between these players in our energy system, what their playbook looks like, and what our vision is to really change the game in the way that the energy system is structured and the way that it's worked historically and continues to. In the state of Florida, our energy consumption, so the energy that we are using, is almost 8 times higher than in-state production. We also know that gas and nuclear power provide for over 85% of this energy demand. And nearly all of the fossil gas that is used in the state of Florida is, since it's so much higher than our in-state production, it's actually imported from the Gulf South, from the Gulf Coast in the Gulf South via some major interstate pipelines. And to understand the way the energy system is now and understand the role of our utilities and why they need to change, as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing, it helps us to understand why they are the way they are. And that takes us back to the turn of the 20th century, when electricity was just getting a foothold in some of the biggest American cities. We saw that small power plants were using steam engines to generate electricity, and they were popping up all over. But the power that they produced really could only reach about a mile's distance until we developed 2 key technologies that really changed our relationship with electricity and have shaped American life ever since through the energy system. One of those is more efficient and scalable steam turbines. And the other one is alternating current transformers, or AC transformers. And those could ramp up the voltage high enough to allow electricity to travel really long distances without losing so much wasted energy in the process. And these 2 technologies really formed the foundation of the modern electrical system. It's important to note that steam turbines are a really great example of economies of scale, which is an important concept when we're thinking about the structure of the energy system. And pretty much what that means is the bigger you made these steam turbines, the cheaper the power. And with the AC transmission lines, you could send the power as far as you needed to find customers and to bring them electricity. And to take full advantage of the capabilities of these technologies, you needed scale. You really needed the bigger, the better. And we see that these utility companies continue to really prioritize that. When I talk about an electric utility company, I'm referring to a company that is both generating and often distributing electricity. Now, these companies formed as what we call natural monopolies, because to build this big infrastructure, you need long-term capital investments. And it doesn't really make sense to lay down multiple competing networks where you're kind of being wasteful in the economy, and all of the different competing companies wouldn't be able to capture the full benefits of scaling these technologies. So ultimately, we ended up with these utility companies that are natural monopolies. So often when you think of a utility company, I saw lots of you guys dropping them in the chat earlier, which was awesome. The vast majority of us in the state of Florida rely on an investor-owned utility, also known as an IOU. And this is a for-profit company. It's owned by shareholders, and it's governed by private boards and employees that may be appointed to make decisions for the company. It is locked in this regulatory compact, as we call it. And that pretty much means that because it is allowed to exist as a monopoly and have some guaranteed customers because it has far less competition, it is under oversight from the PSC, or Public Service Commission, which we're going to be talking about a lot today. And that is different than some other models, some other types of electric utilities that are less common but increasing because they are much more suitable and much more beneficial for communities as we're transitioning to renewable energy. So those are municipal utilities and electric cooperatives, or worker-owned utilities. And these are both not for profit. A municipal utility is going to be owned more so by the community. Sometimes it has oversight by the PSC, but often it's governed by public officials and some kind of elected or appointed board that could include citizens, it could include other public officials, but that's usually how decisions are made on governing that utility. Whereas the worker-owned enterprise is owned by its members who are residents, and often both the producers and the consumers of that energy are the same people. And the decisions for that utility are often made by the members themselves on boards that are elected.
Thanks, Natalia. So we were learning a little bit about the different kind of electric utilities that we have in the state, the investor-owned utilities, which is Florida Power and Light, which is the biggest utility, a parent company, NextEra. Duke Energy happens to be the biggest utility in the entire country, the second largest in Florida, and Tampa Electric, and then the other larger, what we call municipal electric companies, Jacksonville's utility, as well as Orlando, OUC, and JEA as well. And the other player up there, you see NextEra Energy, and that's the parent company for Florida Power and Light. And they are the biggest wind and solar producers in the whole country. So they're very powerful and do compete in a lot of states. However, they don't compete in Florida because they are one of the investor-owned utilities that has a franchise agreement. So I think we can go to the next slide. There you go. So we're going to talk a little bit about where the fuel comes from. And in Florida, we send about $64.5 billion a year out of state each and every year to bring in fuel from somewhere else, because some of these fuels that we're going to talk about, fossil fuels like coal and gas. So you hear a lot about natural gas, fracked gas, methane gas, and it's important because in Florida, we're very reliant on gas. I would say we are heavily reliant on fossil gas. And for many, many years, people in the environmental movement thought of gas as being less of a problem than burning coal. So if everything is kind of going as well as it can be, a gas plant would put out about half the emissions of a coal plant. But when you frack, when you use the process of hydraulic fracturing, known as fracking, in that process, you can release methane. And then that gas, that fossil gas, that methane is piped to power plants in other places. And even during the process, there's leakage in the transporting of the gas. There are many of us who, appreciate that it's probably one of the very best marketing campaigns ever, because the perception is that natural gas is all clean. But in many, many cases, the greenhouse gas emissions profile of a gas plant is as much as a coal-fired power plant. So that is a problem. And that's, of course, why we're on the call tonight, because of the climate crisis. So we cannot continue to emit greenhouse gas emissions. So we are about 74% reliant on gas in the state of Florida, and it's never good to be over-reliant on any one fuel source. And you can see in kind of the bright blue on the end where we are in terms of renewables. It's really a minor amount of our fuel mix comes from renewables. It's just about 2% that's solar. So we're going to need to do better. You can see nuclear power. It's only Florida Power and Light, and they sell some part of that to Orlando Utility Commission, OUC. So nuclear power is pretty limited in the state. There was a time when there was an effort to build some more nuclear power plants, but it's so incredibly expensive and no one knows what to do with the radioactive waste. So we're probably not going to see any new nuclear plants in Florida. So I think that kind of covers it. So what you're seeing in the dark blue there is fossil fuels, and a lot of it is gas. There's still a little bit of coal that everybody is weaning off, and that's happening. So people that are working on environmental issues are trying to get rid of the coal faster and not build any new gas. So that's what this is all about. Next slide. Great. So we talked a little bit, and Natalia did a great job of just sort of leading up to understanding why we have this regulatory compact, why we put franchise agreements, because at that time, you know, that was really necessary to provide universal service, which when these electric systems were put into place, that was a need. And it's obviously we live in a different world now. Here we all are on Zoom from all, you know, across the state of Florida, and technology is different. And we'll talk about this throughout the evening. The cost of solar's dropped 90% in the last 10 years. So we have opportunities and technologies that exist now that didn't when that got started. So each one of these investor-owned utilities, they cover about 75% of the state. And the municipal electric companies that we discussed, City of Tallahassee, Jacksonville, Orlando, Lakeland, that's about 15% of the state. And there are also some rural electric cooperatives as well. But the investor and utilities are, you know, the big players, of course, in this. So the way it works is that they get a guaranteed range of a rate of return on any kind of investments, capital expenditures. So the way that they are regulated, they get, it's a benefit, they get a range of a rate of return on their investment when they build things, capital investments. So if you're building a power plant or transmission lines or undergrounding transmission lines, so those kind of capital investment. So one of the problems is that we had a regulatory, you know, construct that made a lot of sense when it first started, and things are changing. I'm not suggesting we don't need some kind of a grid to operate. There are, you know, there are sort of limitations with some things in the way that electricity is moved, and things are changing now. You see more and more talk about battery storage and microgrids. And again, these are newer technologies that are becoming not only more effective, but also less expensive. So we can afford, you know, to move in that direction. So we are in new territory. Right now, we're all connected to a grid in Florida. It's by law, you need to be connected to the grid. And I don't believe that's going to particularly change anytime soon. But the ability to provide your own energy with solar power always was an opportunity to become more efficient in your home, which is the first thing that you want to do. So just think about it like this. I know for many years, you know, people will say, why don't, you know, utilities want to help people save more energy? And when they go to build a power plant, they go before the Florida Public Service Commission in a process that's called a need determination. And they do decide whether they need that power or they can meet the power more cost effectively. So the utilities will argue that they need to build that power. And then every 3 years or so, they come in for a rate increase. And we're now in that process where rates have just been approved for the 3 big investor-owned utilities. And that's what they put those investments into their rate base. And then the customers will pay for that over time, over many years. So that's the scenario. And it's there are other states and other places that create policy that shift sort of that old regulatory construct where utilities can make money helping people be more efficient. Or in some places, they make money by actually owning solar and providing solar as a service. So there are numerous ways that the utilities can participate. It's not to say no one needs the utilities, but we do need to do things very differently given the climate crisis and the greenhouse gas emissions. So the fact that there is an incentive, and this is true whether we're talking about investor utilities or a utility in a community like the City of Tallahassee or Orlando, if we all accept and understand that building up greenhouse gas emissions is a problem, we do not want to put an incentive on selling more energy, obviously energy from fossil fuels, from gas or from coal. So it's very, very important that we look to shift incentives in our energy landscape, so we're not, incentivizing and putting a benefit on doing the wrong thing, because we only have a really short period of time to transition to clean energy, and we're in a very exciting time, but we need to move quickly and stop putting big giant fossil fuel investments, into the ground, where they're going to be for 10, 20, 30, or 60 years, depending. So I think we can go to the next slide. I assume we're saving questions to the end. Is that correct? Great.
Hi, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Mathis, and I am the Central Florida Climate Justice Organizer with Florida Rising. I'm going to talk a little bit about household impacts, and then I'm going to tag team with Kim Ross from ReThink as well to talk about community and long-term impacts. One of the major things that we see, or really the major problem that we see in the communities that my organization works with, which are primarily Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, low-income communities, and communities with high rates of elders or a disabled population. We see what's called a high energy burden. And essentially this means that more of a person's monthly bills are dedicated to paying for power and water, like their utilities, than what you would see as far as a percentage or ratio with more privileged communities. And this causes, as you can imagine, this causes a lot of major issues. What we've seen over the course of the pandemic is that it has exacerbated this energy burden exponentially. We've seen much higher rates of utility shutoffs, like disconnections, because of an inability to pay. And we've also seen or heard a lot more stories from our community members about people who are having to make really tough choices between, buying groceries or keeping the lights on. And especially when, we had for such a long time, children were having to go to school virtually. And so, do you, as a single mom with several kids living in public housing, do you make sure that you're eating, because obviously you're going to make sure your kids are eating. Are you going to eat? Are you going to pay the bills so that your kids can go to school? And so, this has also caused a lot of issues with our elders, with people who have chronic health issues. We live in Florida. It gets really hot most of the year. And so, when you're a person who had COVID, we actually saw this quite a bit. People who had COVID would put on ventilators, but then they'd lose power because they couldn't afford to pay for their utilities, and they don't have their oxygen. And so one of the major issues that kind of comes along with this, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but it actually is energy efficiency, which you wouldn't really expect sometimes. But what I've seen, my colleagues and I have seen, is in a lot of these communities, we have families who are paying upwards of $400 a month every single month, and they're just running the bare minimum of their appliances. So I'm going to actually move on to the next, because I'm going to talk a little bit more about the two bottom issues on our next slide, which has to do with community impacts. So largely what we're seeing with this is that the high energy burden, all of these issues that are coming along with, what we're feeling in our homes is directly connected to what we're feeling in our communities as well. And this has to do with this first point on here, which is that utility companies and the people who are making the decisions are not consulting, are not having conversations with the people who are affected most by this. And those are, like I said, what we call frontline communities. These are communities that bear the impacts first and worst of the climate crisis. And this is exacerbated by utilities. And so not only are we having, those issues, we're having health issues that are tied to the burning of fossil fuels in our communities. And Kim's going to talk in a little bit about, or in a couple minutes, about drilling as well, the impacts that has on our communities. We're also seeing a lot of issues and a lot of a lot of impacts on our natural spaces, the environmental impacts we're seeing. We're seeing impacts on our non-human relatives in those spaces because so little consideration is given to how they will respond to this incursion into their spaces. And also just the culturally important spaces that we have. Florida has a very rich indigenous population, and yet so little of their spaces are preserved anymore, and it's so harmful. So I'm just going to stop there. I'm going to pass it over to Kim to talk more about drilling.
All right, thank you. So yeah, we also want to note that these threats happen around communities, not only near power plants, but also near drilling sites. Susan mentioned fracking earlier. And in 2014, we learned after the fact that a well near the farming community of Immokalee, Florida, had been fracked. And while that was eventually shut down and the bad actor had permits revoked, it all occurred after chemicals were used to fracture the rock and to attempt to extract more oil from there. So when fracking occurs, arguably the most dangerous fluid is the one that comes out after the frack, where chemicals are mixed with radioactive elements from deep beneath the Earth's surface. Now, to my knowledge, and I do track this pretty closely, we still, and we will probably never know fully where that fluid was from the Immokalee frack was disposed of, but some of it was brought to a landfill in Miami-Dade. So drilling does occur in Florida, and oil spills and spills of chemicals that relate to drilling occur on a regular basis. Utility companies have at times fought to be able to drill and frack here in Florida, as well as fighting to have their ratepayers pay for fracking in other states. And like so many other things that we've discussed, it's those communities that are living closest to the drill sites that show that health and quality of life impacts. In fact, there have been that show health and quality of life impacts. In fact, there have been over 400 studies compiled to show that fracking is very dangerous to those living near drill sites. And in the meantime, even now, there's a drilling permit being applied for that's near Immokalee yet again. In the wellfield protection zone for 3 public water supply well fields, 2 for Immokalee and 1 for the Seminole Tribe of Florida. So you can message me if you'd like some more information about that. But all of these things, household and community impacts, they also, everything that we're talking about leads to long-term impacts. From air and water pollution to land degradation, the extractive policies that impact individuals also impact communities and the earth. And these compounding impacts of climate change, burning fossil fuels, which is the main paradigm of the utility companies, that increases pollutions and greenhouse gas emissions, that heats the earth, which in turn causes sea level rise, droughts, floods, and the extreme heat most parts of the United States, including us here in Florida, felt this summer. That extreme heat causes more severe storms. And all of these problems also motivate those who can afford it to move to higher lands, causing climate gentrification and economic hardship. In addition, the heat causes both health issues and a need for more air conditioning, not just to live comfortably, but also to live safely. So the energy burden increases and the housing crisis increases. And then according to seating sovereignty, there is a direct correlation between increased rates of sexual abuse, trafficking, and domestic violence against women and children, especially Indigenous women and children, in regions where fossil fuel extraction companies set up man camps to house workers. Meanwhile, although the industry likes to talk about creating jobs, they're beholden to their shareholders and are concerned with their bottom line profit. And so when they can, they actually are reducing the number of jobs available. In Florida, the utility monopoly already means they don't need to be too concerned with keeping you satisfied, whether you're a customer or employee. And they merely need to ensure their shareholders' satisfaction. And these long-term impacts affect us all, yes, but privilege creates a bubble, to quote my friends from Florida Rising. And it's those without a safety net that are most impacted. And the more vulnerable communities fall through the cracks. And this also impacts Indigenous communities where the extractive industry inevitably, sorry, I'm moving on, impacts their land and their communities by drilling, fracking, and building pipelines through their land, again, without permission. So Elizabeth, I'm not sure if you have anything you want to add, or if we shall turn it over to the next person.
You did a great job, Kim.
Now we're going to talk about the regulators. And in Florida, for the largest utility companies, they're regulated by an agency in Tallahassee, in the state capital, called the Florida Public Service Commission. So those are the people that every 5 years set conservation goals. They do a need determination process to determine whether or not a new power plant is needed, and they decide things like what costs are passed on to customers through a process called cost recovery. In 11 states, public service commissions are elected. In Florida, they are appointed by the governor, and there is a committee made up primarily of state legislators that are the Public Service Commission nominating council. So they send 3 names up to the governor, and then the governor selects. The newest commissioner, as you see up there on the screen, is Gabby Pasadoma. She was just appointed to the Florida Public Service Commission. She was on, at least for a short period of time, as their staff person, as a staff person at the Florida Public Service Commissioner. So as well, on the far left, Mike LaRosa was in the Florida legislature for a number of years, and he was also recently appointed. It is not uncommon for former lawmakers, to go on to this commission and other commissions like that. So let's go to the next slide. So now my colleague, Zach Costner, helped develop this slide. So I'm kind of taking it in now. So I already talked about issue 1 and how commissioners are appointed and then confirmed by the Florida Senate as well. So it's typically in Florida, the utilities usually sort of get what they request out of the Public Service Commission. And Kim Ross referred to this earlier. A few years back, the Florida Public Service Commission had determined that Florida Power and Light, one of the utilities, could add into their rate base an investment that they had in a fracking company in Oklahoma. So it was a real departure from existing law. And in actually the industrial users, some of the big users in the state, along with the public council, took that case all the way to the Florida Supreme Court, where they ruled that you could not put an investment in something that's really iffy, which any drilling operation is iffy into the rate base. So there, was something that happened and was an example of the Public Service Commission, doing what was asked by the utilities, even though it was quite a departure from current regulation. So I think with that, I can go to the next slide. I think that's you, Heaven. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you. So this has been covered so well from Susan and my other peers here, but we've really laid it out for you how this works. This is the playbook, and this is also being chatted about a lot in the chat. So being that we are a regulated market and there is monopoly control of the utilities customers, they have no competition. So this was asked earlier in the chat, how does Florida Power and Light get to serve all of Miami-Dade County? And that's because this is a monopoly and they are able to service an area that's assigned to them. What we have covered a little bit, but not completely, is how they come to control our legislature and Public Service Commission. So as Susan was just covering on what our Public Service Commission looks like, it is appointed, not elected. So there's definitely some influence that happens behind the scenes. One recent example is last year, there was a workshop discussing distributed solar and net metering at the Public Service Commission. And one of the most vocal commissioners who was vocally supporting distributed solar rights, which the utilities are very often not completely for, has now been appointed into a new position. And then the money that they inject into the legislature, this is public and this is not something that they hide. So Florida Power and Light especially has been subjected to a lot of media scrutiny and watchdog scrutiny regarding this. And this happens pretty much every year. However, they are completely correct in what they share. And what they share is that we are doing nothing wrong and we are following all the proper protocol and reporting what we spend, including ratepayer dollars, on lobbying and donations. So that is reported, which is what they are required to do. And then number 3, you see how, as was earlier discussed, they make their money from large infrastructure projects. So I believe Susan said this earlier, but incentivizing investment in this way does not do anything for us, the consumer. Looking at how they dominate the narrative, we can definitely see this here with trying to control all renewables in general and how those are equitably distributed across Florida. So in Florida, we don't have several policies that enable more equitable participation in the renewable sphere. Things like virtual net metering, which creates true community solar. However, what we've seen is a utility co-opting of the word and the phrase community solar and them creating their own projects that do not have the same financial benefit to the participants as true community solar, like we see in Minnesota and Maryland. Those are really good models for true community solar. And then, of course, this is just a vicious cycle, right? Just rinse and repeat and go back to the Public Service Commission and get more money flowing back to you. So that is the playbook in a nutshell. I'll put some really helpful in-depth reading into the chat as well, but I want to move us along so that we have plenty of time to answer some of your questions. We can go to the next slide.
Thank you so much for that, Heaven. I am going to shift us a little bit towards what our vision is for changing this energy system, because we see that, of course, in the context of the climate crisis, there is so much that needs to change about the way that energy is generated and used. But it's also a huge opportunity to look at this energy system and transform the system itself and how it's governed and how all of these consumers and producers and players are benefiting or being held responsible for the burdens and the costs of producing electricity to sustain some things that are just needs that are essential in the 21st century. So our vision includes a couple of things. First off, energy efficiency for all. Energy efficiency is so important in both reducing the cost of energy and minimizing energy that is wasted in the process of getting it from generation to transmission to just you using the energy. It also minimizes the need for maintenance if you have more efficient infrastructure. The process of increasing efficiency, sometimes you may hear the term weatherization, that can create jobs and local jobs because somebody has to go and do that on site. It also increases health and security for communities because it increases the chance that they have to meet their energy needs at a cost that is affordable, from a system that's more accessible and in a way that is already available to them using the infrastructure that they have. So that's energy efficiency. The next one is disaster preparedness, and that's really connected to this idea of climate resilience. All right, and resilience isn't okay on its own. We should be able to bounce back and recover, but we should also be proactive. We should be building in a resilience in a way that we're able to better recover from storms and climate impacts, but also build more secure and healthy lives so that when those impacts and those events happen, we are better equipped to continue meeting our needs and continue supporting our communities. And having a more local energy system, having more renewable power can do all of these things. Move on to the next slide, please. Wonderful. And there are two important pieces to get us to this place, to energy efficiency for all, to deeper democracy, to more deep and networked climate resilience. And these are a couple of those pieces. One is more community ownership. That can be rooftop solar on a home or business by that entity, or cooperative ownership of a community solar project, which if you look at the picture on the bottom right, that shows what that could look like. Often it's an installation in an area that is well accessible to the public and usually very visual, like a community center or the top of a parking garage or a library, something of that sort. And then folks can participate in that community solar project by subscribing to a different part of the bigger grid, as you can see in the image. So they're benefiting from that renewable energy that's generated, even though maybe they're a renter or somebody who has a roof that just can't take a panel, can't hold it. And all of this change comes under the umbrella of a shift towards energy democracy and decentralization, moving away from this corporate-owned model that's very centralized and has generated this economy that broadly is really reliant and linked to fossil fuels and that exploitation and extraction, and moving towards energy that's governed by communities, that's reducing and minimizing harm, that's supporting local economies to build wealth for communities and for both the producers and consumers in a way that is supporting their health and well-being. Wonderful. So today, now we're going to transition into a little bit of an interactive discussion. If you could please pull out your cell phone, or you can also minimize this tab and open another on the internet. We're going to have a little activity where we're really excited to collect some of your feedback on this presentation and generally how you feel and what you think of when you think about the energy system. I've seen so much activity in the chat today. We'd love to just do this with you all. So I am going to share my screen in just one moment. Wonderful. And you should be able to see some added instructions to go ahead and join us on Menti. You can either go to www.menti.com and enter the code on your screen, or you can use this QR code, just shoot your cell phone camera at it, and it should take you to the link. Seeing we have 23 people, but we definitely have a lot of participants here. So Please, if you have access to either another tab on your computer or a cell phone or really any other device with access to the internet, we'd love to have you engage with us in this way. Okay, I'm going to jump in. Okay, so the first thing we have here is, what is one thing you were surprised to hear today? You should, on whatever device you're on, be able to see this question. We have some translations just below, and feel free to drop your answer. One thing you were surprised to hear today. Our first one is how much the energy system is tied and really reliant on gas. The fact that public service commissioners are appointed, that's also a good one. How much energy comes from gas? Yeah, we're definitely very, very reliant on gas in the state of Florida. That other gas plants have been defeated, absolutely. The environmental justice movement and communities themselves and their agency have really been so important in ensuring that their voices are heard in how these development projects are considered. And there's so much more progress for us to make in continuing to advocate for our vision and push back against continued development of gas infrastructure. Some of you guys are funny too. This is great. lots of things. Awesome. Yeah, nuclear resources are also used in some of these utilities fuel mixes. That's another one. Nuclear energy is definitely, it's among the top sources that we're reliant on in the state of Florida. In the status quo and how we're seeing the energy system structured now. Alrighty, this is wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and transition us to the next question. If you have a lot of thoughts about any particular question, you're welcome to stay on it, but Menti will encourage you to follow the group. So I'm going to switch this over. Just kidding, hold on. Perfect. What topic from today do you still have questions about? Or it could be a related topic that maybe wasn't touched on today. I see we have a first one focused on our agency and what can we do as a movement, right? How can we maybe advocate for a different process? You know, is it just their behavior that's the problem? We also talked about appointment. Is it the process of appointment that we, you know, have issue with? How can we have more transparency and more accountability? Really important things. How energy companies charge people for solar. Yeah, what does that utility scale solar look like? You know, we talked about how that even when they brand it as community solar, it's not necessarily bringing all the financial benefits that you could be reaping, that we could all be reaping from our energy system, and really, really understanding how those charges are set up. How can I best support a just transition to renewables? That is a great question. Part of our follow-up step 2 from that changing the game slide is I'll be reaching out a little bit later this week with lots of resources that are Clean Energy for All partners put together, from energy assistance to tools for advocates to opportunities for you to engage more on these issues. So we'll work on all of that, building that together. What is involved in setting up an energy cooperative? Those worker-owned utilities, that's a great question. How do we electrify everything and make sure it's done with renewables? Another great question. Because electrification is one step, but you got to make sure the power is coming from renewables too, right? It's an important part of the conversation. Alrighty, folks, these are wonderful. So many important questions, and we hope to continue having these conversations with you all. So feel free to keep them coming, but we are going to dive into all of these questions from you, and hopefully I'll be able to just build a model where we're all learning from each other and we're able to answer these questions together. So definitely keep an eye out for that. Going to move this over. Okay. What do you usually hear about utilities when talking with your family, friends, or neighbors? Alrighty, I'm seeing a couple things pop on the screen. A lot of stuff about, about cost, definitely, I agree. So many fees, the bills are already so high, the prices are only increasing. What the heck are all these extra charges and fees? I hear the same things. Sometimes other things as well, but oftentimes the first thing we think of when we think about our utilities is that monthly bill, right? It's the most immediate thing that impacts us, and it's a really consistent connection that we have with these utility companies. And it's so unfortunate that that has to be the only, part of the energy system that is so front of mind for us, when we know that there's all this opportunity to really change and transform the structure of the energy system to actually benefit from it. Not really understanding what can be asked to change the system or how it's structured, all these things. Lack of trust, wondering why aren't there more incentives to go solar and to have more solar and storage, so we can have a resilient grid that's also sustainable and bringing local benefits. Oftentimes, all we have is questions. Heaven did such an excellent job talking about how these utility companies also often dominate the narrative. They make themselves the main character in all of the stories when we think about the energy system. So often that limits the types of things we can think of, especially under the important principles of like accountability and holding them responsible for their decisions. Why can't I go off the grid? It's tricky. There are technical challenges. It's awfully expensive to just leave these companies. So we often become locked in this cycle, right? That's why this is also important. That's why this movement is so important. That's why your advocacy is so important, because the people's agency and really expressing what our priorities are for our communities and what we need, and just saying that these horrible impacts are just unacceptable, and that the climate crisis and all of the other harms that are caused by the energy system cannot bear to exist any longer. Alrighty, I'm gonna take us to the next one. Ooh, some of you guys came ahead of the game. This one is, what is one thing that you learned that you're thinking more people should know about? Something that caught your attention. Maybe it's something you knew a little bit about before, or something you didn't know at all. And you were like, wow, other people should know about this. This is something that would really get us all moving in alignment. This is something that there's just not enough information on. See, some of the early answers were how the commission is appointed, how the PSC works in general, and how much influence these monopoly utilities really have over the process. Absolutely. Stuff about radioactive and toxic waste that is locally impacting different counties throughout South Florida, but throughout Florida at large, really. More about community solar. Lots of things, how FPL dominates the narrative. Yeah, FPL is just now becoming the largest investor-owned utility, or IOU, in Florida. They'll be serving over half of the people who live in our state, so the majority of us will be reliant on them, as is the status quo. Background more about the types of electric utility models. Yeah, understanding those business models is really important. Having access to that kind of information helps you to think about how the energy system could be structured differently, and what could your role be, because there are also, owners and members and workers in these alternative business models, for sure. How utilities contribute to households that are energy burdened. Absolutely. That's the result of decisions. It's not just that, we're born into energy magically costing that much. Those are people making decisions, and people that are supposed to be holding them accountable to benefiting the community when they're still not. And so all of those are business decisions, are policy decisions, and people and entities that are acting in that way that we need to be holding responsible. Absolutely. Okay, and I have one final question I'm going to go ahead and take us to. Now, this last question is, what is one thing that you'd like folks working in energy justice and utility accountability to prioritize? With what you learned today, with all that you've experienced, you've seen and read and learned and lived, what do you want to see as a bigger priority? It could be something broad, it could be something very specific. What do we need more of? What do we need to have at the center? Our first one here is be fair to all people, fairness, just that simple principle of justice. And at the same time, transitioning to renewables. It's interesting how all these pieces come together. We also have the disproportionate siting of energy infrastructure in marginalized communities. When we have these structures and these systems that really diminish the people's agency, even if we transition to renewables, we have to make sure that the system is fair for all people, because if this energy infrastructure is harming communities that are being marginalized, that are being excluded, that are being diminished, that are being harmed or disadvantaged. It's really clean energy for the benefit of who, right? More about rooftop solar and utility scale solar. The need to stop destroying our limited drinking water supply. And really empowering communities in a transparent process to make decisions about our energy system. I love that one. It's so important that we prioritize the community's agency in achieving all of these things. Because as soon as we gain access to the information and start learning about the possibilities, all of the benefits, and the historic and ongoing harms that are created and advanced by the energy system, we truly start to understand and feel connected to all of the opportunities to transform the energy system. There should be a limit to the percentage of your income that you pay for energy. That would be a wonderful thing to prioritize. I agree. How much burden can one consumer bear? It's just wonderful things here, folks. Thank you all for your contributions. If you, again, feel strongly about any of these questions, I invite you, you're more than welcome to go back through and share your thoughts, your feelings, and your priorities here, so that, like I mentioned, we can have shared learning spaces, we can provide more of the resources and the opportunities and the events that we want to learn more about and share more about with our communities, and work towards this vision, right? Start making progress, starting projects, participating in campaigns to really see these things through. So just one more time on behalf of all of my colleagues, all of the other wonderful panelists, or panelists on Zoom, but my peers and coalition partners, thank you so much for your time, everyone, for sharing it with us. And I hope that you learned a couple things this evening, maybe also are taking away a little bit more energy in its other definition, and energy to continue doing this work, to hold our utilities accountable, to prioritize justice in the transition to renewables, and to think about opportunities to transform the energy system and learn more about doing so.